They're everywhere. These impeccably dressed men and women in perfectly tailored suits, sipping tea on pristine lawns while entire nations dance to their tune. And what's shocking isn't just that they built the largest empire in human history, controlling more territory than Genghis Khan ever dreamed of, but that most people today don't realize the British Empire never actually disappeared. It just got better at hiding, transforming from obvious colonial occupation into something far more sophisticated and infinitely more permanent. A system so brilliantly designed that countries celebrate their independence while still bowing to the crown. And if you think I'm exaggerating, just wait until you see exactly how deep this rabbit hole goes. By the 1900s, the sun literally never set on British territory because they controlled roughly 35 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface. But controlling that much land with that few British citizens required something extraordinary. They needed to manufacture a special class of human beings, people so thoroughly indoctrinated into British superiority that they could govern millions of colonized subjects without ever questioning whether what they were doing was right. And this manufacturing process began at age 7 in places called public schools, which were actually extremely private and extraordinarily brutal boarding institutions designed to break children down and rebuild them as perfect imperial administrators. The education system was so harsh it makes modern military boot camps look gentle, because these children were forced to read and memorize classical texts from Homer to Virgil in their original Greek and Latin, while sleeping in unheated dormitories regardless of how cold British winters became, eating monotonous and insufficient meals that left them constantly hungry and, considering hot water, an unimaginable luxury reserved for only the most special occasions. And this wasn't accidental cruelty but deliberate policy designed to teach these future governors, military officers, and colonial administrators that they could endure any hardship the empire might demand of them. Physical punishment was not just common but celebrated as character building, with teachers freely administering canings and whippings for even minor infractions. And the youngest students, some as young as 7 years old, were forced to become personal servants to older students, polishing their shoes, preparing their tea, cleaning their rooms, and running errands like medieval squires serving knights, all of which was designed to teach them the rigid hierarchy they would later enforce across the empire, where white British administrators stood at the top and everyone else existed solely to serve their interests. These children lived away from their families from age 7 until 18, and this separation was considered essential for toughening them up and preventing emotional weakness, because family relationships in Victorian Britain were deliberately kept distant and cold, with fathers almost never showing physical affection or discussing emotions with their children, leaving all developmental guidance to teachers and headmasters who specialized in creating emotionally stunted men capable of ruling foreign lands without ever feeling guilt or empathy for the people they oppressed. But it wasn't just children who were controlled by elaborate social rules. The entire British aristocracy operated under an incredibly complex system of etiquette that governed every aspect of life. And these rules served a crucial purpose beyond mere snobbery. They created a unified ruling class that could instantly recognize each other anywhere in the world and maintain absolute solidarity against outsiders, whether those outsiders were working-class British citizens or colonized subjects in Africa and Asia. Women in aristocratic society couldn't directly express their feelings or intentions because that was considered improper, so they developed secret communication languages using accessories like fans and gloves, where holding a fan against the right cheek meant yes to a marriage proposal while holding it against the left cheek meant no, and dropping the fan meant let's just be friends. And these seemingly silly rules actually served a serious purpose by creating barriers that kept the aristocratic class exclusive and ensured that only people who'd been trained from childhood in these elaborate codes could ever truly belong. Even flowers became a language for secret romantic communication, because a man couldn't speak directly to a woman he hadn't been formally introduced to without committing a serious social offense. So couples who were secretly courting developed symbolic meanings for different flowers, where yellow roses meant jealousy, lavender meant distrust, and yellow tulips meant hopeless love awaiting an answer. And this entire elaborate system of flower communication actually came from Istanbul, introduced to Britain through the letters of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who lived in Ottoman Istanbul in the early 18th century, and observed the Selam tradition in Ottoman palaces where objects carried hidden messages. Mourning periods were rigidly codified with specific rules about how long different relatives should wear black clothing after someone died, and a widow was expected to mourn her husband for at least 2.5 years, with the first year being heavy mourning where she wore completely black matte fabrics and lived in almost complete social isolation. And Queen Victoria herself wore black for 40 years after her husband Prince Albert died, setting an example of extreme devotion that the entire aristocracy was expected to admire and emulate. The British aristocracy even developed a special vocabulary to distinguish themselves from lower classes, refusing to say toilet and instead using the term lavatory, because they considered toilet a working-class word unfit for refined speech, and women's roles were clearly defined as bearing children and being good wives who were expected to be intelligent enough to hold conversations, but never so intelligent that they outshone their husbands in public, because that would upset the careful social balance. Every single aspect of aristocratic life, down to the smallest detail, was meticulously regulated and controlled. And this was absolutely necessary because these people were going to rule Britain's overseas territories. And in every country they went to, they needed to appear as shining examples of civilization, objects of admiration and envy, and even godlike figures who clearly deserved to rule over lesser races. In British colonial territories, there would typically be around 300 British administrators governing populations of millions, and these administrators maintained their authority through a deliberate strategy of physical and social separation that made them appear almost supernatural to the colonized populations they ruled, because they understood that familiarity breeds contempt, and that if they lived among the natives as equals, their mystique and authority would quickly evaporate. British colonizers were required to build themselves the most luxurious and modern neighborhoods in whatever territory they occupied, creating little islands of Britain complete with their own exclusive clubs, churches, schools, cricket pitches, and polo fields where they could maintain their social rituals, traditions, language, and lifestyle exactly as if they'd never left Britain, and all the British administrators in a colony would know each other, live in the same district together, and socialize exclusively with each other in what they called living like the British. Socializing with natives beyond what was absolutely necessary for colonial administration was strictly forbidden, because British administrators believed that treating locals as social equals would undermine the authority and mystery that made colonial rule possible. And those who broke this rule by forming genuine friendships or romantic relationships with colonized subjects were ostracized from the British community and often sent back to Britain in disgrace, essentially ending their colonial careers. Dress codes could never be compromised under any circumstances. So even in the scorching heat of African colonies, men were expected to wear wool jackets, ties, and top hats, while women wore corsets, multi-layered skirts, and gloves, because this wasn't just fashion preference but an essential symbol of civilization and Britishness. And sacrificing comfort for appearance was considered proof of willpower and evidence that they were fundamentally different from the natives who sensibly dressed for the climate. The obsession with propriety was so extreme that piano legs were covered with cloth because the word leg might remind people of human legs and therefore be considered slightly sexual, and wine was considered an elite drink while beer was working class, though getting drunk and passing out was considered a sign of weak character and frowned upon, because a gentleman should at least be able to walk straight no matter how much he'd consumed. These unshakable rules and sense of unity were absolutely crucial for British colonizers, who maintained that no British person could be tried or punished by a native judge regardless of what crimes they committed, because only British courts or courts specifically authorized by Britain could judge British citizens. And anyone who attempted to judge or punish a British colonizer faced the death penalty, creating a two-tiered legal system where British people literally existed above the law. British colonizers were so distant from natives that even household servants could only be spoken to when giving necessary orders, and servants' shadows weren't allowed to fall on their British employers because that would be punished, and speaking any language other than English in the home, listening to native music, or displaying local artwork was completely unthinkable because the success of a British household was measured by how thoroughly British it remained, despite being thousands of miles from Britain. The British Empire didn't want to leave a single piece of land on Earth unexplored or unclaimed, so they created the worldwide scouting movement, opening the first scout schools as a systematic way to instill the spirit of adventure, exploration, and imperial service into British youth from an early age. And this all began during the Boer War in South Africa, when Lord Robert Baden-Powell and his troops were besieged in a small town for 217 days. During this siege, Baden-Powell observed the tremendous contributions made by British children who were trapped in the besieged town, and he said that if young people are given responsibility and trusted with important tasks, they can achieve incredible things, and this observation led him to create the scouting movement that would train generations of British youth in wilderness survival, discipline, patriotism, and practical skills that would prepare them to serve the Empire wherever they were sent. The British Crown provided financial sponsorship to young British people who wanted to become explorers, sending them to unknown territories around the world, and young men who'd supposedly been softened by city life were sent into nature to be toughened up with survival skills and military-style discipline, supposedly preparing them to serve the Empire in whatever capacity it needed. And what's remarkable is how this system continues today with scouting organizations in almost every country. Even though Queen Victoria sat on the throne of the British Empire, she was largely a symbolic ruler without the power to declare war or make laws, because she wasn't a chess player controlling the empire, but rather the chessboard itself, a figure standing above the game who inspired everyone and gave meaning to the entire system, while actual political power was held by prime ministers and parliament who made the real decisions. The entire system was built as a collaboration between parliament, the military, and businessmen who benefited from imperial expansion, and particularly ambitious and imperialist prime ministers like Lord Palmerston, Benjamin Disraeli, and William Gladstone made the political and military decisions necessary for the empire's expansion, spreading British influence and control across the globe through a combination of brilliant strategies. Indirect rule was especially used in Africa, where instead of directly governing territories with thousands of British administrators, they left existing local leaders nominally in charge while British advisors stood behind them holding the real power. So these leaders continued governing their own people under British supervision, which meant that when anything went wrong, the local population would blame their own leaders rather than the British, which is incredibly clever psychological manipulation. Divide and rule was another core strategy where the British deliberately used ethnic and religious divisions to their advantage, wearing down different groups against each other, and in India they created hundreds of small kingdoms and set them all against each other, while in Cyprus they used tensions between Turks and Greeks as a tool to maintain their own control. Speaking of Cyprus, many people don't realize that Britain still controls territory there even today, because Sultan Abdul Hamid II temporarily gave Cyprus to Britain in 1878 through the Cyprus Convention in exchange for British support against Russia, and the British took advantage of this opportunity and never left. So even though they supposedly withdrew in 1960, Akrotiri and Dhekelia remain British sovereign territory, meaning there are actually 3 separate states on Cyprus today, not 2. The reason there's a Greek Cypriot section, the reason many Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus citizens also hold British citizenship, the reason Cyprus drives on the left side of the road, all of this traces back to British rule that continued until 1960 and Sultan Abdul Hamid's decision to give them the island in the first place. Financial control was another key element where the British left local rulers to deal with their population's problems, while British companies extracted minerals, produced goods, and enriched British citizens through massive commercial operations, and local rulers and prominent natives received shares of the system, which automatically eliminated rebellion mechanisms, while ordinary native populations were left with devastated nature and depleted minds. Cultural hegemony meant the British aimed to turn colonized peoples into miniature reflections of themselves, making English the language of commerce, government, and education, while adapting their own social habits to these populations, which is why cricket is the most popular sport today in countries like Pakistan and India, and they opened British-style schools in colonies to create an elite class among the local population who viewed the British as a superior society, adopted their system, and served as administrators within the empire, creating a middle layer that protected British interests. The system was actually simple: protect British interests, eliminate opposition, and if you can't do it today, then do it tomorrow. And one more clever British move was prioritizing autocratically governed countries where a single person ruled and their word was law, because controlling that one leader meant controlling the entire country, whereas in democratically governed countries with separation of powers, even if one group was convinced there would be opposition from other groups, and if one branch of government was captured, other branches would stand against it. So basically, what colonizing British most feared was separation of powers and rule of law, because these were the most important factors that would make colonization and occupation difficult. Today, the British continue to enjoy the material prosperity from both their Victorian-era wealth and the resources that flowed from colonies, and both aristocracy and monarchy continue in their traditional form without interruption, and the modern British royal family is considered at the very top of global elitism, with everyone from Arab kings to heads of state following this tradition and acting according to these protocols. Arab sheikhs who wear local clothing in their own countries can be seen dressed like British gentlemen when standing next to British royalty, because the power of the monarchy extends far beyond what most people realize. And while we habitually call the country England, the state's official name is actually the United Kingdom, with England being just one part along with Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And it's the United Kingdom that's the member of the United Nations, issues passports, and is officially recognized internationally. Even the Gibraltar coast in Spain belongs to them as British overseas territory, despite all of Spain's efforts to reclaim it, and they have territory in Antarctica that's twice the size of Turkey, covered in ice and home to penguins, and numerous other islands and territories around the world still belong to the Crown, including Bermuda, which gives its name to the legendary Bermuda Triangle famous for mysterious disappearances. The Turks and Caicos Islands, which sound like they might be related to Turkey but have no connection to us whatsoever, also belong to the British and serve as vacation destinations with heavenly waters, pristine nature, and extraordinary beauty. And there are countless more territories, especially in the Americas, where many islands of incomparable beauty belong to them. And they even have islands in the Indian Ocean where British citizens can vacation and own property at very reasonable prices. But if that's not enough, let's go even further, because Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Jamaica, and other countries officially recognize King Charles as their monarch, and all these countries have British-appointed governors-general, and the British Governor-General of Australia even removed the Australian Prime Minister from office in 1975. And while this power is rarely used and often considered symbolic, the monarchy has this authority regardless. In other words, friends, even though the colonial era supposedly ended and colonial empires supposedly dissolved, they actually continued to exist in abstract form. And the foundation of this entire system was laid by successful British politicians in the early 1800s. And today, while the entire world still pays the price, the British continue to harvest the rewards. And anywhere in the world, when you pull back the curtain, you can find them operating behind the scenes. I told you the British Empire has no borders. It just learned to hide better, transforming obvious occupation into financial networks, political influence, cultural dominance, and constitutional arrangements that make independence look real while keeping the essential power structures intact. And the genius of this system is that most people don't even realize it's still operating, because it's been normalized over generations until it seems natural that English is the global language of business, that London remains one of the world's financial capitals, that Commonwealth nations send their brightest students to Oxford and Cambridge, that former colonies still use British legal systems and parliamentary procedures. The empire didn't end, it evolved, shedding the expensive burden of direct administration while maintaining all the profitable elements through corporations, banks, international institutions, and carefully cultivated relationships with local elites who were educated in British schools and trained to see British systems as superior. And this is why you'll find British military bases on Cyprus, British banks financing African development, British oil companies extracting Middle Eastern petroleum, British universities educating Asian leaders' children, and British monarchs receiving state visits from presidents of supposedly independent nations who still seek the crown's approval and blessing. The Victorian-era administrators who wore wool suits in African heat and refused to socialize with natives established a template that continues today in different forms, with international businessmen in expensive suits flying business class to developing nations, staying in luxury hotels separated from local populations, conducting meetings in English regardless of location, and extracting wealth through contracts and deals that benefit London-based corporations while leaving local populations with depleted resources and environmental damage. This is the empire that never ended. It just learned to wear different clothes, speak different languages when necessary, and hide its mechanisms behind concepts like free trade, development aid, and international cooperation, all while maintaining the essential relationship established in Victoria's time, where British interests come first and everyone else exists to serve them. And the remarkable thing is how successfully they've convinced the world that this system is normal, natural, and inevitable, rather than the continuation of colonial exploitation by other means.